hale and the hearty, right? When we get to this stage, post-break, a little sugar, a little fun. Anyway, I am delighted to see those of you who are here. I thought, as we tell a few stories, I might just begin to add to the context. Thank you, Vince. I'm on the Vince Stelly team, to say that he always gives a format of about too few minutes to address very complex and wonderful issues. But I'm going to give a brief story of why we care, to hopefully enlarge the reasons why you care, to then hear a wonderful condensed talk, right, Tim, and then hear a little bit more from Brian, too, and take a few of your questions, too. Well, in 2009, left my post with public broadcasting to start an office in one to join a foundation that for many years had been funding biomedical scientists. And of course, with a little bit of the curiosity that Corbett talked about earlier that comes out of journalism, we wanted to know a little bit more about the environment they were in. Of course, I was able to bring on people like Jonathan Cart. Hey, Jonathan, yes, from our office. And we've started building a team that started thinking about not only what are the issues that affect and influence the media environment, but also civic engagement and democracy, and where does science fit in all of that to this. Along the way, we started asking lots of questions, even so much so that we had the opportunity, and by the way, Brian's in it too, the Oxford Handbook of Science and Science Communications probably isn't on your desk yet, but maybe soon. And we started asking, because the chapter we were responsible for was how are foundations, how is philanthropy using evidence-based information to help people who are making decisions, key decisions in our society, and influence policy too. And guess what we found? I'm not going to wait until you have to read the chapter, I promise to this. But we found that there were a lot of people who were caring very much about key and controversial and important topics, whether it related to climate change or the Zika virus or things that relate to health and other things, but who were doing things almost by the seat of their pants because they were not connecting with the communication scientists, i.e. the people who were doing research in this area, nor if there were basic scientists or other kinds of scientists. They weren't connected with the communication scientists. And matter of fact, the whole science culture didn't necessarily support the Carl Sagans of the future, or the two gentlemen here who are with me today who are very good at this. So part of our work with media impact funders and others, whether it's the National Academy and so forth, is to help people understand if we care about misinformation, if we care about knowledge creation and dissemination and engagement, if we care about some of these same factors of how we do this, we really need to start thinking to take care of our precious time and resources on how what we know that actually works. So we need to support the research, we need to support the practice, and we really need to support some wonderful talks. And you're going to hear about some of the opportunities and barriers here, and I'm really delighted. Thank you also, Vince, for scouting. Vince scouts at places like PopTech and Yes Frank, and you can hear more about those places later. But just to know that Tim Jorgensen has a variety of ways he could identify himself. But what I loved about your recent book, you said, "In the dark, all cats are jaguars." And that begins a book that starts about, his first chapter, Strange Glow, the story of radiation. And he talks about how fear can lead us to exaggerate risks, creating challenges for effective science communication. He is an associate professor of radiation medicine and director of the Health, Physics, and Radiation Protection graduate program at Georgetown University, and he studies how genetics influence the risk of cancer and the body's responses to radiation. He also studies how people evaluate and react to the risks of radiation in everyday life, and this is a topic that I know you'll want to be reading in his book or seeing on his PopTech talk too. So with that, I'm going to ask if you could start for a few minutes, and then I'm going to go to Brian afterwards because we're going to discuss what you've been talking about and what else we want to add. Good.
Sounds good. Thank you, Elizabeth.
So I'm a college professor, so I'm used to talking for hours at a time. So when someone tells me to talk for 10, 15 minutes, it's a big challenge, okay? So see how we do here. This is, what I'd like to talk to you today is about the war on science. And in case you haven't heard, there is a war on science. It's been going on for quite a while now, and it's been pretty well covered in the media. There are a number of books that have been written on it. So who are the combatants in this war? They are basically the scientists on one side, the public on the other side, and some of the media. And so the problem here is that we've gotten to the point where people no longer believe that man landed on the moon. They think that vaccines cause autism. They think that, climate change is a hoax. So we've gotten to a very serious level of ignorance. Now, who's to blame for this? If you ask the public will tell you, well, you know, the scientists, they're in the pocket of industry. They're in cahoots with the government to conspire against us. They just basically don't trust the scientists. If you ask the scientists will tell you stuff like, oh, well, it's the general failure of the American educational system, public educational system. So they'll tell you that it's the fault of the federal government is no longer funding science at the level it was before. They'll say it's a general anti-intellectual climate on the rise in the United States. So this is a pretty sad situation. So I have my own take on this, which I'm going to share with you in a minute. But before I get to that, I'd like to tell you a little story. So the way that I got interested in science, I went on a class trip when I was in grade school, and we went to the Museum of Natural History in New York. And I liked stuffed zebras and stuffed lions just as much as the other kids, but the thing that really fascinated me was something I found in the gift shop. It's one of these radiometers, which I'm sure that many of you have seen. It looks like a little light bulb. It's got a weather vane inside. You put it in the light, it starts to spin. So I was completely fascinated with this thing. So I bought it. I brought it home. I played with it for a while. I could never figure out how it worked. I moved on to other things, but that kind of spurred my interest in science. So what I didn't know at the time was that this was not a newfangled invention that was available in the gift shop. This had been around for 100 years, and it was originally invented by William Crookes, who was a scientist who liked to make little gadgets. And so he made this. He didn't know what it was doing either, but he liked to say it, and he sold a lot of them. He made a lot of money. And even Albert Einstein weighed in on what the heck this thing is doing. I'm not going to keep you in suspense any longer. The way it works is that there's a heat differential between the panes, because one is black and one is white, and that gets air currents moving, and that's how it spins. So it's been around, it had been entertaining and attracting people for many years. What I also didn't know was this was not the most remarkable invention that Crookes had. This was the most remarkable little gadget that he made, and this is called a Crookes tube in honor of him. And this is a different type of tube. It doesn't have any air in it. There's no air currents involved. It's a vacuum tube, so all the air has been removed. You can see that there's a little Maltese cross on a stand there, and there are places for electrodes. And the way you play with this thing, it's not for children. You put a high voltage source across those electrons, you turn it on, and you see something very interesting. You see this. The tube glows in the dark. And so at the time, nobody really understood what was going on here. You can see the shadow of the cross against the glass there, and the glass is glowing. And this was completely fascinating. It was completely fascinating to scientists because they didn't know what was going on. And it was just really fascinating to people in general because they'd never seen anything like this before. So everybody was playing with these things. The public, the scientists, everyone was trying to figure out what was going on. And so it turns out that, here's an example. Mark Twain even had one. He played with his Crookes tube on occasion. So again, not to keep you in suspense, what was finally discovered was that there were charged particles that came from the one electrode, the cathode electrode, and they were propelled to the end of the tube, and the cross made a shadow, and so you were seeing the charged particles interacting with the glass and causing some fluorescent material in the glass to glow. And they called them cathode rays since they came from the tube. And now we know that these cathode rays are actually just electrons. So this tube allowed the discovery of electrons. There's actually 2 Nobel Prizes came out of people playing with this tube. The second thing, the discovery with this tube, was made by William Röntgen. Röntgen was a physicist in Germany. He had his tube. He was playing with it. He was trying to figure out what was going on with the cathode rays. And what he found out was there was another type of ray that was coming from this tube that had nothing to do with cathode rays. And this type of ray could go through solid matter. And this was something that was completely unheard of. He thought he was going crazy. okay, because these things were going. He did all types of controls to be sure that it was actually going through matter, and he used a magnet to be sure it wasn't a cathode ray, because a cathode ray could be deflected with a magnet. And what he showed was that he discovered a new type of ray. He published a paper called On a New Type of Ray, and we now know these as X-rays. He called them X-rays because he didn't know what they were up to. So the interesting thing about this is that he rushed to publish this in a scientific journal, but at the same time, he also published it in the press. He sent that figure, which was his wife's hand, to a newspaper in Paris. The newspaper published it so that the newspaper story and the scientific publication came out simultaneously, which was very rare for that time. And you didn't have to have any scientific knowledge to understand that this was a useful thing. You just looked at that picture and you knew that this could be used in medicine. So Röntgen became an absolute celebrity. And this spread around the world. At McGill University, a doctor read about this in a paper in Canada, and he had a patient in the hospital who had been shot in the leg, couldn't figure out where the bullet is. He runs out, he gets a Crookes tube from the physics department, comes over, x-rays the leg, removes the bullet, saves the guy's leg. This is just in a few weeks after the discovery of x-rays. In Chicago, there's a medical student. The medical student is working in a Crookes tube lab. They're making Crookes tubes. And he finds that his hands are getting burned when he does this work. He doesn't know what's going on. He reads the story in the newspaper, and he concludes that the x-rays are burning his hands. So he goes into school with his hands bandaged. His professors say to him, "What's wrong with your hands?" And he tells them the story and says that he thinks that x-rays are to blame. And one of his professors says, well, if it can do that to normal tissue, maybe it can be used to burn out cancer cells. So the very next day, they bring a woman in who's suffering from advanced breast cancer, and they treat her. They give her a total of 18 treatments, and her breast tumor shrinks. Well, this spreads like wildfire. So he's got all these patients. Other doctors are getting into this. It's going around the world. People started treating with cancer with X-rays. By 1899, the first cancer cure is discovered. I want you to note that Röntgen published his discovery in December 29th, 1895. So it was used for diagnostics a few days later. It was used for therapy January 28th. That's only 30 days from its discovery. Absolutely unheard, bench to bedside science. So very rapidly spread. Pretty soon, all the scientists in the world are working on X-rays. They had to make their own X-ray journal. This is a cover from one of the journals, the X-ray Journal. I want to point out to you that in this cover, that angel-like figure is supposed to depict science. She's holding a Crookes tube in her hand, and she's spreading X-rays all over the surface of the Earth to the benefit of mankind. So the scientists were enthused. The public, again, notice the date here, February 1896. This is just weeks after the discovery. The public is also enthused, although they have different ideas about what you can use this for. So simultaneously, he is a celebrity among scientists, he's a celebrity among the public. So whatever happened to him? Well, the scientists recognized him. They awarded him the first Nobel Prize in Physics. So he won the first Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of X-rays. Back in his home country of Germany, he was practically worshipped as a god, and they made a statue to him, and they put it on the Brooklyn Bridge. Not the Brooklyn, the Berlin Bridge, okay? It's not the Brooklyn. You can tell I spent some time in New York. The Berlin Bridge. And this statue remained there through the First World War, through the Second World War. In the final weeks of the Second World War, when the Allies were surrounding Berlin, the Nazis melted it down for its metal. Today on this bridge, there is a centaur embracing a fish. So much for the war on science, so much for Röntgen. He has been largely forgotten by the public. He was the most famous scientist among the public until Albert Einstein showed up on the scene. So the public may have forgotten. People are still curious. So why are we waging this war? Well, I have my own battle scars in the war on science. At one point about 15 or so years ago, a journalist called me, said he was doing a story about radiation therapy, didn't even know enough about radiation to do the story, could have an informational interview so he could learn enough about radiation to do the story. So I said yes. I talked to the guy for 45 minutes or so. Pretty soon he publishes this absolutely sensational story about about the dangers of radiation and all that. He takes quotes of mine out of context. It was just a travesty. You know, he had deceived the public, he had deceived me, he'd used my name to give legitimacy to his article. I was very upset. So I decided at that point I would never talk to journalists again. That was it, because they were not interested in delivering the truth. They were only interested in printing sensational stories. But then this happened. In 2011, well, you all know about the accident at Fukushima. And again, the journalists started calling me, asking me to comment on the health hazards of this event. And my initial instinct was to say no, just as I had for 15 years. They're going to screw it up. But then I thought to myself, over those 15 years, I have seen a lot of people who profess to be radiation experts get on television, get on the news, and say all kinds of preposterous things and get the public all upset about, which is often nothing. And so I decided that if I wasn't part of the solution to that, then I was part of the problem. So I agreed to do these interviews. So we have a media person at Georgetown, and she arranged for me to do a local interview on television, and then pretty soon that was seen, and pretty soon I was that guy on TV. And so for that period that followed the week at Fukushima, I was on television almost every day, mostly with CNN, and I was the person that was answering these questions. So one day that really struck me was CNN called me one day when the Japanese were releasing water into the ocean, radioactive water into the ocean. And they called me and they said, the Japanese are releasing 11,000 tons of radioactive water into the ocean. Can you come down and comment? So I get in the cab, I'm heading down to the studio, I'm thinking like, who reports volumes in tons? I mean, how much is 11,000 tons of water? You don't say, go to the gas station, say, give me a quarter of a ton of gas. You don't do that. So I converted the tons into a volume, and then I thought, well, I need some kind of mental picture of this. So then I wondered, well, how much is in an Olympic swimming pool? So I converted it into Olympic swimming pools, and in case you're interested, 11,000 tons of water is equal to 5 Olympic swimming pools of water. So thank God for Google. We had a nice talk about Google earlier today. So you can immediately Google and say, how much water is in the Pacific Ocean? Which I did, and then I converted that into swimming pools. And if you're interested in that, it's 300 trillion Olympic swimming pools of water in the Pacific Ocean. So I went down there, they posed the question, I gave them the answer, and then I explained how I thought the radioactivity would dilute very rapidly in the seawater, and I didn't think that there was going to be much of a problem there. And so a day or so later, I thought to myself, I wonder if anybody paid any attention to that analogy I made. So again, thanks to Google, I Googled it, and I found out that I had been quoted 9,660 times on this, okay? And so sometimes with attribution, most of the time without. But that didn't bother me. The thing that interested me about this, it told me that it wasn't that people weren't interested in the science, but they wanted the science in a digestible form that they could relate to. They wanted it in the form of a story. So then I started getting questions. Okay, I got questions because the people that see me on TV, you Google radiation, my name comes up. So the first, they started about questions about radiation from Fukushima, but then there were all kinds of questions. And these questions were coming from very educated people. They were coming from doctors, lawyers, engineers. And I realized that it's very difficult for intelligent and educated people to get information because the information they get is usually locked in some type of scientific journal. It's entrenched in jargon. It's very hard to get to. So I thought maybe what's needed is a book that targets this particular group of people. So I contemplated writing such a book, and I asked my colleagues for advice. They said, don't do it. And the reason was, in their opinion, in order to tell the story to the public, you would have to dumb down the science to the point that it would be almost unrecognizable to the scientists. In doing that, you would impeach your credibility and basically risk your career. So that was the scientist's view, but I decided that I would move ahead anyway. So I wrote this book. And the structure of the book is very similar to what Joshua Johnson was saying earlier. You have to tell people stories. So basically, this book is a book of stories. And it progresses all the way from the discovery of X-rays, which is the story I just told you. And it goes all the way up to Fukushima, nuclear warfare, and things like that. So the strategy of the book is that you tell a story, and then in order to follow the story, you need to know some information, some technical information. So the narrative interrupts, you get some technical information, and just when you think you cannot stand one more technical piece of information, the narrative resumes and you're back to the story. So that's basically the strategy of the book. So I wrote the book this way, and I was worried. I was worried about what my colleagues had said. I thought, well, you know, I put this out there, maybe the public will love it, and my colleagues will hate it, maybe my colleagues will hate it, the public will love it. Maybe everyone's going to hate it, you know. So I was very worried when it came out. But I'm happy to say that it was well received by both fields, both the scientists and the public. The reviews have been pretty uniformly positive, and then the book has gotten a number of recognitions. So I was still upset a little bit because when I read the reviews from the public, there was always some kind of, not always, but often, a negative preamble. This is my favorite. I approached the book with low expectations. Ho-hum, I thought, a book about radiation by a professor, probably some dumb memoir by a retired old boy. That's how the positive review starts, okay? And there were similar ones. I did not expect to enjoy this. And so it disturbed me because I thought, have we gotten to a point with the public where no matter what we do, no matter how we package it, no matter how they are turned off, they are tuned out, they are just not the type of thing that's going to attract their interest. So I was disturbed about that, and it just happened, while I was mulling about this, I got an email come through. And this email was from a Boy Scout counselor, and he was actually using my book to instruct Boy Scouts to how to get their nuclear science merit badge. And yes, there is a nuclear science merit badge. I had to corroborate that. There is a nuclear science merit badge. And so this gave me hope, because I thought, even though adults may have tuned out science, the youth is still receptive, as I was receptive when I was young. And that maybe there's hope if we can target this message at the youth. So Carl Sagan once said, every kid starts out as a natural-born scientist, and then we beat it out of them. And that's basically true. You know, the way that we teach science, the way that we approach science is often a turn-off to young people. So I got a long-winded way to get to my take on this. So my take on the war on science is that scientists have to own up that they have a lot of the blame for the war on science. And the reason for that is they have failed to communicate the joy of scientific discovery to the public. That's the first problem. The second problem is they cannot expect the media to do the heavy lifting on this, okay? They have to own the narrative. They have to tell the journalists what, in a story that they can understand, what's important, why the story needs to be told. If they just put a whole bunch of graphs and figures in the journalist's hands and expect them to convert that into the narrative, it's never going to work. And then the last thing is we have to focus this message on the youth. And because they are still receptive, we may have lost a lot of the adults. And if we lose the youth, we're going to go through another generation of the war on science. So my take on this is that the science have to own up responsibility. They have to make peace with the public, and if they make peace with the public, perhaps we can put an end once and for all to this war on science. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's terrific. I'm now, as I introduce and enlarge the conversation with Brian, Brian's studies have really addressed the effects of mass communication on people's attitudes towards the Zika virus, energy use, tobacco, and he directs RTI's international radio program on science in the public sphere, where he brings social science to new audiences through his radio show, The Measure of Everyday Life. It's very accessible, and hope you'll listen for it too, because recent topics have included topics such as literacy education, hate speech, the future of long-term care, And I think the 100th episode featured science and statistics behind the college basketball's March Madness. He's also the author of the book Social Networks and Popular Understanding of Science and Health, as well as the co-editor of the forthcoming Misinformation and Mass Audiences. And this is the first comprehensive social science volume on this topic. These are topics we've all been talking about, of course, today. And as you're listening to Tim, part of our conversation earlier is how we even connect the social science with the scientist to then be more effective in communicating and engaging audiences. Can you give us some of your reflections?
Yeah, no, I think what I love, and I know, Elizabeth, you've done this in your work as well, this is the historical take that you offer here. And you can really pose this question as to how is it that we are in this moment now when, decades ago, perhaps we were at a time when we could celebrate and offer a scientist as a celebrity. I think we all need to step back and to recognize what powerful forces professionalization and socialization are. That we have grown as in terms of population, in terms of audiences, and in terms of the institutions that do some of this work. It was a smaller world in those days. There were fewer, perhaps even attending to some of those elite media outlets. We now have businesses that are attending to audiences in all kinds of different ways. And I think that that's part of what's happened is that we've seen this in lots of different places where there's a sort of bureaucracy that's set in, and we are operating in different silos. And so there is a yawning gap, I think, between a lot of folks who are working in these different areas, and that's not going to change on its own. It's not going to change automatically. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to build forums to do this translational work. And I think that's exactly where some of this work is headed, but it's not necessarily surprising. There are a lot of the factors in place that have led us to this point, and I think those patterns are going to continue on if we don't do something dramatic about it, probably.
So there's so many points to pick up. I also enjoyed, as you watch Brian's frank talk, 11 minutes, but you use humor and in that as to also try to engage and connect, as I think you both do too. But one of the pieces that I also picked up is that as we try to talk about some of the solutions to dealing with misinformation, you make a point about almost the fire hose versus the squirt gun. And do you want to expand a little bit as you think about some additional specific examples of solutions and what we don't have going for us?
Right. Well, we might worry about the proliferation of misinformation or about critiques of science or other, and that's something that I do think we don't spend enough time thinking about in terms of just the sheer volume of information that's available out there. And we often bemoan the fact that we've posted something on a website somewhere as a corrective, and to not recognize that it's going to take just as much effort to put a spotlight on that as it took to have the proliferated misinformation. So, Tim's over here telling this, the story, and that's great. But how many had necessarily encountered, this, prior to having a spotlight put on the book? I think that's a really important piece. One of the points that we make with the new book, with Misinformation and Mass Audiences, corrective efforts very much that's possible to actually correct misperceptions, to counter the narrative that's out there, but it does take a counterweight in terms of the same level of exposure to that information, and it's difficult in the environment that we're in right now.
So another thing that you mentioned, going back in your history, Tim, also talking about how you had your first encounter with journalists did not go so well to this. And what kind of, do you see the science, the culture for scientists changing so that scientists are getting that kind of media training? Do you think the journalism field has, in a sense, the number of people who are dedicated to the beat of science journalism has not been growing? And so tell us what some of the things are happening from a culture point of view that might be needed or that might be changing too, in terms of, because part of it, isn't it also that people need to understand what the scientific process is, so that when a journalist understands that you probably will never have certainty about the work that you're doing because there's always something else to discover.
Right. I can just speak largely from my experience at Georgetown University. I've been to Georgetown University for about 28 years. In the earlier years, you were kind of on your own. The phone rang, you picked it up, someone identified themselves as a journalist, you had to take their word for it, you just spoke to them or didn't speak to them, whatever. Now we have a more ritualized approach. So we have
media officers that are there, and now and they publish a media catalog for the university who experts are on different subjects. So a journalist can look up and say, oh, Dr. Jorgensen is a radiation expert. I have some radiation questions. Could I speak to Dr. Jorgensen? And then that person is kind of vetted by the media office, you know, so people who are not legit or whatever I don't even hear about. And then Karen Tieber, who's our media person, she contacts me and asks if I'll do that. So there is a vetting process. So I don't think I would have had that issue now. The second thing is that the university has been very proactive in helping scientists get their message out. So they frequently offer workshops that are provided by the Alan Alda Center for Science Communication, which is in New York at Stony Brook University, and they provide outreach workshops for universities. So they have a short version, which is just a few hours, or a whole day thing. Georgetown has foot the bill for that, so that faculty can come and get some training in that, and I've gone through that, and I found it to be extremely helpful, and I would encourage all universities to do that kind of thing. So we have a more formalized process now. I think there's lower risk to the scientists, lower risk to the university, and I think it's a dramatic improvement over what we had 20 years ago.
Just to add on that, Elizabeth, I think one of the other issues that we face right now, and this is not going to be news to folks in the room, but we really need to put a spotlight on this, is that we live in a culture where there's a news norm around the utility and the value of breakthroughs and discoveries. And that happens. We celebrated that story in the case of Rankin, right? But that's not all of science. And I think we often want to encourage science literacy in terms of the promotion of particular facts, and our news coverage is around this breakthrough idea, when in fact we need really, I think, deeper acknowledgement of the process of science, of really, and this ought not necessarily be just the realm of breakthrough discoveries, but rather hard work that happens every day to sort of move things forward. And I think that there's a possibility for that, but it really is sort of baked into our frame for what counts as a science story. It may be if some big discovery came through as to life on Mars, that would generate news coverage. But all the work that's happening right now in a lab somewhere, somebody's doing important work that's actually advancing our knowledge with regards to that. That's nowhere to be seen. So I think there's some both blame to be laid there at journalistic culture, and not necessarily any individual journalist, but also recognition of that we have to really work against. And I think that we have to think through what it means to be promoting scientific literacy per se.
And is this part of also, maybe we might think in the journalism space, that the trend towards less long-form journalism, less investigative journalism, less patience with things, in a sense that even our news cycles might be shorter. Basic research is very long form, if you will, to this. But what did, both of you came, really had much more engagement due to a crisis, in other words, a public health crisis. And I'm going to ask you first, Brian, in terms of the Zika, what happened there? If you could tell us a little bit more about how you became more engaged.
That's there. Great. It's a great example, actually, because it's something that at RTI International, we're an independent nonprofit research institute. We have the ability, at times of crisis, when issues emerge, to sometimes put resources behind and to study different areas, and we did that in the early days of the Zika outbreak. One of the things that we did was monitor public discourse. We monitored social media mentions. We monitored what was happening in terms of people's search behavior. And there's a sense, everybody in the room has a sense of Zika virus as a known topic. And yet, from the standpoint of public attention, it's remarkable, the patterns that you see. Remarkable in terms of how ephemeral those moments really are. When you actually track all of what was happening in that ecosphere, there was a marked peak that around the time of the WHO's announcement around this, and then things fell off within days, per se. So we were working against that for folks that are wanting to do work in emerging infectious disease. The recognition that there are brief moments of spotlight that are incredibly ephemeral, and that's something that we found and documented in a paper in Emerging Infectious Diseases. But I don't know, Timothy, you see the same pattern where there are these brief moments, probably similar around Fukushima, right?
Yeah, I mean, the chief motivator for people to get information is fear. I mean, and And so usually questions come to me when some event has happened that people are afraid of. And sometimes the only thing they want, the only information they want is up to the point you tell them they shouldn't be afraid, and then their interest kind of plummets. So that is a problem. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's probably a natural thing to be very interested in the thing you're afraid of, but that's an issue that scientists are just going to have to deal with.
You know, one aspect of that that's really important for a conversation like this is to think about the importance of folks that professionally, you know, every day are working with regards to human emotion. You know, not just psychologists, but you know, the storytellers of the world, you know, that are understanding what happens in terms of emotional response to media content. We often think about that as you know, divorced from the realm of science communication, but I would argue that there's almost no dimension of the human experience that's more important than our emotional lives and our emotional selves in terms of predicting engagement with you know, scientific information. It both constrains, but I also think that there are positive opportunities as well. The excitement around you know, new information, the possibility for you know, framing things in that way. So I think that's a really an underappreciated aspect of all of this.
One of the other things we were finding out too, that whilst environmental scientists might be talking to environmental scientists, or within certain fields or disciplines in science, there hasn't been a lot of cross-talking, if you will, interdisciplinary, and yet science itself is converging in terms of you're bringing in engineers with computer data scientists and biological scientists and so forth. We're also started talking about, are there lots of spaces for the social scientists or the behavioral scientists to interact with scientists across different areas, and I think that's just a ripe opportunity, as well as bringing in the media and others to start talking about how we engage and capture attention, capture mind and heart, and maybe even change some behavior, especially when we have such enormously important problems that facing us in so many different areas that are especially controversial. What has your experience been in terms of finding those spaces where we can have those convergent discussions? Yes.
Paul Slovic is a social scientist who's done a lot of work on what makes people afraid. And so I've read a lot of his work in relation to radiation, for example. And he's found that people are more afraid of man-made things than natural things. So, you know, if a nuclear power plant is more worrisome than, let's say, radon coming out of the ground, without any knowledge of what the actual risk levels are, they think, well, radon is natural, so it's... usually their fear has nothing to do with the reality in terms of risk, okay? There's absolutely very little correlation between the real risk and what they fear. And so it's always, I think the goal for real science, real hard science and social science is to try to merge those things together so that the facts and the understanding by the public better matches the reality. So you should worry more about the things that are high risk and not worry so much about the things that are low risk. And I think that we can't do that without a better understanding from the social scientists, because we radiation people don't know what the hell people are worried about.
And I think just very briefly say that for me, a lot of it comes down to a matter of courage, really. I think that being willing to sort of step outside of our professional boxes and our specialized conferences to have discussions, you know, like this, but not being afraid to call up somebody like Tim and to, you know, invite into discussion. There are all kinds of things working against that. And I think that we have to we're at a point where I think we just need to sort of break out of that, because it's really in all of our best interest to try and do that. But the disciplinary boundaries that you're talking about, despite our lip service to interdisciplinary this and interdisciplinary that, are still very real and very much there. So we need people to be building you know, stages and forums where we can have that kind of conversation.
Right. And we're continuing some with the National Academy in terms of the secular colloquial. David Rousseau is going to come and help us with a funders breakfast and so forth too. Is there a question or two that someone has? Yes.
Jeffrey Jones with the Peabody Awards and Peabody Media Center. In the 1950s, the John Birch Society propagated this myth of fluoride in public water was going to turn us into Inco commies. You know, I'm very interested in the challenge over mutually agreed upon facts in today's society, because there's a lot of money to be made, and there is a lot of political influence to be made. The John Birchers today, thank you, Vince. The John Birchers today are Fox News and Alex Jones and Breitbart. How do we deal with that? How do we, as scientists or that community or funders, challenge the basic facts that people are making money off in challenging agreed upon science?
I'll defer that to you.
Oh, thanks. It's an easy question. So no, it's a central question of our time, right? And I think that I know we're just about out of time for this session, but I think one thing I would say, and one thing that gives me hope at 3 in the morning, is the idea that eventually the predictive value of information is going to rise to the fore. Eventually, misinformation can be effective and useful in the short term, but eventually there's going to be a market, I think, for value that has credibility. We're going to see, I think, the resurgence of some journalistic institutions that just 5-10 years ago we were talking about sort of the internet, making everything go away in terms of business models. And I think that that's something that gives me hope that, but it's going to be a mess until we get there. I think that we are going to go through some rough times where we're seeing exactly what we're seeing now in terms of chaos. But over the long term, there are folks that are going to have turned out to be right about climate change. They're going to turn out to be right about what's happening in a coastal community. They're going to turn out to be right about what happens with regards to vaccines. And I think we need to put a spotlight on that when, in fact, we can look retrospectively at some of those success stories, and there might be some value in that.
And this is a topic we go in great detail. I know we even sometimes when we don't talk about climate change, but we talk about the impact of it, it's working in some communities about to changing some behaviors too. But I think David Hauser, you have the last question? Or you don't? You're okay? All right. Well, it turns out we're out of time. They say wrap up in big letters. Thank you very much.